Cool. So, welcome to nap time, because I don't know how many concepts you guys have. I had to go on like right to sleep, aka implementing an enterprise design system the Red Hat way. If you're looking for Docker containers and stuff, that's the other session. I work at Red Hat. We're the Linux company. I mean, there are others, but we don't really talk about them much. My name's Reese. There's some sort of informative blurb up there, but I'm a Drupal developer. I'm a programmer. That's what I do. As a kind of a specific note with this presentation, there's a bit of a prerequisite. And we're going to kind of try to work around that today. If everybody could please put your hand up. I know you're tired after lunch, but come on, hands up in the air. If you have used a design system tool like PatternFly, or a tool set like KSS Node, or built a site with standalone Twig components, please put your hand down. Okay, so we do have some people who are kind of new to building sites with components and patterns, right? So I'll try to keep that in mind. That's what this previous presentation that I give is about. Sometimes they have the same type of stuff at Drupal conferences. Unfortunately, we didn't get one this year, but I will work with you guys on that in the short 45 minutes or so that we have here. So if building sites with components is like the main thing in Star Wars of building sites, this is like the Star Wars story, or the Drupal story version, right? It's a prequel, sequel sort of thing. We're going to cover some background, some vocabulary, and then we're going to actually get into the meat of it. Design systems the Red Hat way are kind of divided into three parts when we're talking about them. The first part is going to be your philosophy behind it, right? If you don't have the vocabulary, if you don't have the philosophy, you're out of tools to talk about what you're doing with other developers. The second then is the implementation itself, which is kind of the meat of the topic here, and that's dealing with Drupal, dealing with your development toolkits, dealing with the actual code. And then, of course, finally, the standalone Drupal integration. That is more along the side of modules that you're going to be using for Drupal. The two we're going to cover today are UI patterns in Drupal 8 and Pattern Kit in Drupal 7. So first part, digital design philosophy. This is kind of like the whole background story. This is the tale of Captain Jack Sparrow for design systems. Let's get to it. When we're talking about digital design philosophy, there are three things that power it: branding, marketing, and UX. All of those three things kind of combine to make up what powers the background for your digital design philosophy. So branding is your colors, your visual patterns that you're using, your typography, the way that you're talking about your brand, the voice you're using when you're communicating with customers. Red Hat has their own internal brand site that kind of delineates how all this works for us. Our shadow logo, our word mark, where you need copyright symbols and trademarks, and how that's handled, and keep it all uniform, right? So that covers our branding. But in order to talk about our design systems, we need to talk about the difference between a design language and a design system and its implementation. So they're actually two separate things. You'll hear a lot of people use those kind of words interchangeably, but really there's kind of a strict definition to it. So design languages are visual. They're a set of rules that kind of delineate communication. It's very graphical in nature. So this visual language isn't something that's necessarily just words or tooling, but it's visual. So here's some examples of that, because like I said, it's visual. Words aren't going to really do it justice. Skeuomorphic design. So this is something that was kind of popular in like the 2000s. The early Apple products all kind of had examples of this, but that's where you take the real world and bring its analog into the digital world. So the idea being, if you know what a calculator does or a keyboard on a desk, you put it in the digital world, you intuitively kind of grasp how to deal with it. One of the downsides of skeuomorphic design, though, is it is pretty noisy. So as a response to that, the community started to go into flat design. And these are all, again, visual languages, right? This isn't a design system. This isn't design system implementation. This is visual language. So when you're communicating with someone about visual language and about your design system, they're two separate things. Some other examples are material design. I'm sure everyone's familiar with how Google does their material design on their products and everything. It's a hot topic. Things like vertical design, like, okay, if you're designing something in a digital medium and the primary user interaction is scrolling, that means you can tell a story vertically, and they'll be able to interact with it and understand it in a more procedural manner. Or there's a whole bunch of other ones out there, like Microsoft has its own Metro Microsoft design language. Airbnb has one. There's the US web standards. You can kind of Google all of these and bring them up. But again, these are all visual design languages, not necessarily design systems. Design systems are organizational. This is where you get into the tooling. This is where you get into your rule sets. This is where you get into developer side communication and not just on the design side. So this is for working with other developers. It's very structural in nature, and it has to do with everything from taking your visual language and communicating it to other developers to implementing it onto your site. So here's some examples of that. I'm sure everyone knows atomic design. If not, this is an idea kind of put up by Brad Frost and implemented in Pattern Lab. And you can also kind of see it talked about around the internet. And this stuff kind of all goes back to the origin of modern web design, which is monolithic design, where you come in and you build a whole page all at once, right? And you bring that to the client and make your changes and rules, and your developers would go build all these pages together. And so we evolved from that into modular design, which is the idea that your website is composed of these little design modules that all follow your visual language, right? And this is the implementation of your design system. And then from there, we kind of, in where we are today with atomic design style tiles, which is we're not just building modules anymore, but we're building atoms and molecules and organisms that combine together into our templates and pages to build up a site. So this presentation really isn't on atomic design. If you want to learn more about it, there's a link down here at the bottom. It's a really awesome set of blog posts from Brad Frost that kind of go into it. The idea is we're getting way more granular, right? Our structural systems are evolving, they're getting more complicated, and we're no longer just saying like, oh yeah, it's web design, good enough. We're breaking it apart now and building better vocabulary to talk about these things. So altogether, our digital design philosophy is everything we just talked about, which is the branding, marketing, and UX that drives it, the design languages, the visual languages that we use to describe the aesthetics of the site, and then the system itself, which is our structure and organization for putting everything together. So if you have all of your philosophy covered, what's the next step? Next step is going to be your deliverables. So this is where you get your designers talking to your front-end developers and back-end developers and stakeholders. These are things like mood boards, your PDFs, the little booklets that you're going to deliver, over email or whatever. Even everything down to your initial CSS and HTML mockups when you're getting this design communication over from your designers to your developers and everything. But the real question with all of this is, how do we get those design deliverables, our PDF or whatever, into working implementation, especially across multiple enterprise scale properties? So Red Hat doesn't just have redhat.com, but we also have other applications. We have a customer portal, we have a Connect site, right? We got people here that work on those teams, and there's a whole bunch of them, way more than what I'm just going to cover today. But all of them need to follow those branding and marketing and UX standards, and all of them need to use the same design system, the same visual language for it to be familiar and workable with our customers. So that's where you get that kind of like really big question of how do we get that across, right? It's not just as easy as, oh, well, here's a PDF, this is what it should look like, go. So this is where we get into the design system's implementation itself. There's kind of two different ways to do that. First is rule sets. Rule sets are your design system docs. You write them in Word or Google Docs or Confluence or however you want to do it. And you can even write them in like a style guide. So if you're familiar with things like KSS Node, and so I know some guys here said they're not familiar with using these type of tools, but basically there are a series of pieces of software available in the open source community now that address this particular problem of, if we have a rule set for how we're building our sites, where do we put that, how do we access it, how do we keep it all in the same place? It's essentially what the software handles. So it's KSS Node, Pattern Lab, Storybook are some of the big examples these days. And then we have design guides / full implementations. So these just aren't rules about how you're going to build your site, but they're actual scaffolding framework, and that's HTML or Twig or CSS or Sass even, that kind of implement those rule sets into code for you and give you a starting place for implementing that design system and visual language together on the site. These are pattern libraries or like frameworks like even Bootstrap kind of falls into this category. So Red Hat has multiple design system frameworks that are all kind of within this scaffolding system and in this line of communication. And for us to be able to communicate effectively to our customers and keep within our branding and marketing and UX, we're going to have to kind of pick and choose between these, right? And so most of the time what ends up happening if you're working with clients or even working in a large enterprise is you're going to go in there and like copy paste, you know, or here's our reference implementation, just go build a new one and write it up in, you know, whatever the cool thing is today in handlebars or whatever. And for us that wasn't really good enough because we already have all of these frameworks that we're building for our sites. We already have really awesome open source tools that address some of these problems. Why can't we just all use them on the same site? So as a lead up to that, here's kind of like a preview of our systems. Our first one is called WebRH. This is both a style rule set and an implementation. So it's not just a series of guidelines, and it's not just a framework for building sites together, but it's actually both mixed together, and that's Sass and CSS. We use Twig, just like you would in Drupal 8 for all of our markup. And then we use something called JSON Schema. If you're not familiar with that, it's basically a JSON description of a schema implementation. So what fields are there, what type of fields are they, what properties do they have, how do they relate to others. And this isn't something that's specific to us. This is like an open source thing you can go jasonschema.org and take a look at and reference. And we have YAML for our documentation itself. So that's the rule set, is that YAML. And then the Twig patterns and JSON schema and Sass are the actual implementation. It is pretty darn complicated though. Like that's a lot of information to digest. Like, okay, you got all this tech for, you know, a single implementation. But it works pretty well. This powers our editors and builders across Red Hat, which are tightly coupled together as well. So that's kind of like another caveat there. It does power multiple properties at Red Hat. So my team uses it, the .com team uses it, even Customer Portal has a background that kind of comes from this WebRH library. Here's kind of what it looks like. So on the, wait for the other image to load. Okay, there we go. So this is kind of a preview. Like when I said it's complicated, it's complicated. This is paragraphs in the Drupal, and so each one of these things is like getting powered and brought in from the JSON schema on the back end. So all of this pattern, library, design systems implementation is getting thrown into Drupal on the front end. But it is really awesome and a really good way to build a kind of specific marketing sites. One of the other ones we have at Red Hat is called PatternFly. PatternFly is open source. You can get to it on patternfly.org. It is both a style rule set and a guide for creating single-page applications, all the way to multi-page, like Drupal-powered applications. They can all use it. It's Bootstrap-based, it's very scalable, and it is skinnable. So we actually have an internal version called RTUE. That's just a skin over this on top of Bootstrap. We built OpenShift.com with it. We have a couple of other client and consumer-based portals that are all built with PatternFly. I'll give you a little bit of a preview of that. But this is right off of patternfly.org. These are the patterns that we've been using to build our application sides to our sites and be able to get all that technology kind of working together. And you can see there's a whole bunch of them. I mean, this stuff ships, it's open source, it's free. You can go grab it and use it on your sites pretty much today. My team also has its own framework. This is the Connect team. It's a style rule set and an implementation as well. It's Sass, CSS. It uses the same Twig patterns, JSON schema, and YAML documentation in cases. It works well with WebRH and PatternFly, and that's kind of the whole point of architecting all this was, well, we already have these existing systems, how do we get them to play nice together? And this implementation itself is very dev-centric. So here's a preview of it. This one's just generated with KSS Node, but it may as well just work in Pattern Lab or any other dev toolkit that you have. But these are all application-specific patterns that don't exist already in WebRH or in PatternFly, or the open source system. So now that we have each of our frameworks, right, so we have these 3 different frameworks that are all kind of playing nicely together on the same site, that's kind of step 1, right, of your implementation, is taking this technology and making it play nice together and understanding where it's coming from. But part 2 is the adoption, education, and training needed to make this stuff work at an enterprise level. So this is kind of the tricky part, right? Like, technology is there, and hopefully we'll have time to do a little bit of demo as to how all this is put together. But that's just step one, right? You can build it, but it doesn't mean that they will come. So first part of that, adoption. This is selling it to the business. This is where cost studies and comparisons kind of come in handy. And this is something that we've done internally at Red Hat. Like our .com team has put together, oh, well, here's a marketing page that we built 6 months ago, and we built that the standard Drupal way, right? Here's how much it cost, how much time was invested in it. Here's how many developers worked on it for X many hours. And now we went ahead and took this system with using WebRH and PatternFly, and we built the same type of marketing page. And here's the cost reductions and the savings and everything. So the business can understand it, right? They speak that language. And they go, okay, I understand these aren't identical pages, but we do see how they relate to each other and where these cost savings are coming in from using these enterprise scale design systems. Then, of course, you can't just build it once and call it a day. You got to sell it to other developers, especially at the enterprise scale. So this is where we started doing something that's essentially a scrum of scrums. Once a month, we have everybody who's working with our web patterns at Red Hat get together in a web patterns working group, and we kind of talk through the different issues that we're having and how we're handling some of the problems in our teams and where we can share code and where we can learn from each other. And taking that approach of, instead of trying to just sell this stuff and get everybody on the same page, but from the approach of let's learn from each other and let's ask questions, has really increased the amount of communication and adoption across teams. So just coming in and having that kind of humble approach is, I think, a lot better than trying to just push everyone to use the same system. Second is documentation. So one of the things that we've kind of struggled with and that we're learning is really useful is documentation doesn't need to be standalone. It doesn't need to be something that you just make in a Google Doc or something and share out. It really needs to be integrated with a style guide. So if you are writing, your Twig file and your HTML markup and your Sass and your JSON schema, and it needs to have that YAML documentation is what we use, but you can do it inline or in a markdown file, however you want to do it. Just make sure it's included with the code. And you also want to make sure it's not just something local. You don't want to just clone this from a Git repo and, oh yeah, just dig around in there, it'll be great. You want to make sure it's hosted where you can say, hey, let's go to this URL and look at it together and talk about it. It's something that you can send a link to someone and say, here's the documentation somewhere that you don't have to spin it up locally and be able to see how it's all delineated and relates to each other. And then, of course, knowledge shares. We don't just do these presentations at camps and everything. Maybe we won't have a fancy slideshow, but we'll sit down and talk through in our scrum of scrums the technology we're working on and how it goes together. And we don't have a problem setting up standalone meetings hey, let's just go talk about this stuff for a little bit and get on the same page. And then, of course, the most important part, implementation tooling. So this is where we're kind of at currently. You can see there's a whole bunch there, right? All these different tools, everything's kind of all over the place. So what we're doing as a company, and in this scrum of scrums, is working towards a single unified developer tool system. So the goal right now is Pattern Lab with Composer and Gulp and the Pattern Kit module that I mentioned earlier. And that's kind of our development pipeline, right? And the actual code itself is Twig patterns, and we're doing research into making sure that those are going to be web component compatible. So when we build, our new patterns and we use our old systems, they're all going to be able to work with web components as we kind of migrate and move our front end in that direction. So all this together, this is kind of unifying our dev tools, and then of course training and maintaining all of them together. So what you guys are really here for, the Drupal side of stuff. All that's kind of background, right, to getting everything into Drupal. This is kind of where I'm going to take a small segue from the presentation. So there were a couple people who haven't really messed with this stuff yet before, right? You have some hands over here, right? So have you used Twig yet?
Yeah, I've played with all this stuff. I haven't launched a thing.
A site on it or anything like that?
Yeah, it's more just research, and I've done plenty of Twig though.
Okay, so I'm sure you found if you're just using Twig standalone, it's pretty easy to just be all right, here's some markup, here's some variables, and be able to spin up a small pattern, right? A small little modular piece of code that maybe has some styling on it or some JavaScript interactivity, right? Standalone. But if you're using it with Drupal, you gotta use the Drupal template system, right? It's kind of a pain. So there's a solution for that. In Drupal 8, there's the components module, which makes this pretty easy, unless you use these namespaces to pull out these individual items that you're looking at. And there's some other pieces of technology like Pattern Lab or a Storybook or a KSS node that allow you to source these and do all your dev kit tooling. And then you use what's called a presenter template to do your data mapping from Drupal's backend to the front end. And so this is kind of the new way of doing things. Something that started being covered, I think, about 2 years ago as Drupal 8 gained mainstream popularity. People were kind of looking at this problem like, I love being able to build these standalone little patterns that are in my design system implementation, but getting into Drupal is a pain. So the idea being, all right, here's the variables, here's the schema, right, for the pattern, and then here's the stuff that's actually getting pulled out from Drupal in that same template. So this is an entire Twig template, and this is, node.html.twig, your Drupal 8 theme or whatever. And then this is your pattern library, this is your design system implementation. You can say, all right, in my atomic design system, it's the image twig file. And that has all the details that actually render an image, has all the markup, maybe a lazy load JavaScript library or something. And we kind of looked at that and we said, that's pretty complicated. And so did some other people. So right now in Drupal 8, the big project that kind of tackles this design systems implementation into Drupal is called UI Patterns. It's done by this guy, Alex Marcos, really smart dude. I think he talked about it at DrupalCon Barcelona, did like a whole presentation. The idea with it is that you have your design system implementation in Twig, right? It's a Twig file and your CSS file and your JavaScript file. Then you have a YAML schema. We use JSON schemas at Red Hat, but pretty much the same thing. You can also put something like a Fractal or Pattern Lab or Storybook on top of that, and it's totally transparent. Then the UI Patterns module ingests that and then shares that out to other modules in Drupal. So in this case, we got views or display suite or layouts module or field groups. Layouts obviously comes in Drupal 8 core, so you can use that pretty much out of the box. And then that goes and that goes out and it gets sent to the, it gets sent over to the Drupal 8 theme layer and gets rendered on the front end. It does have some drawbacks though, so if you guys are going to go check out this module, you got to keep in mind it's all one-to-one mapping. So if you have a data-driven back end for your system where your articles aren't necessarily one-to-one with what you're going to see on the front end, but rather you're collecting all the data, right, that's necessary for you to build up an article content type, or maybe a product or something, right? You might have paragraphs behind it or something. This module only handles one-to-one mapping. But it does work with Pattern Labs. So I mean, if you're building like a simple like brochureware type site, this is pretty much a good solution. We're still on Drupal 7 in most cases at Red Hat. This is kind of a preview of what that looks like. So for us, this wasn't really an option. Our data system on the back end, especially for the Connect team, is pretty complicated. There's a lot of pre-existing content types and data that we have to worry about. So we went and built something called Pattern Kit. And this is available on Drupal.org as of like 2 or 3 weeks ago. We pushed that up there. This is a Drupal 7 solution, Drupal 8 coming. It supports Twig for Drupal 7, as well as rendering Twig out of the box without Twig for Drupal 7. And so you can basically take a pattern library like PatternFly that I mentioned earlier, the open source design system implementation, drag that into a module, into a Drupal 7 module, write a hook and expose it to Pattern Kit, and you can actually map that over on the back end. So and here's a bit of a preview of what that looks like. So in panels, we'll have all of these patterns listed here that are the patterns coming in from PatternFly, just the Twig templates themselves. You click one and add it to your site, and you get the full JSON schema exposed, where you can go ahead and start mapping out all your data on the back end. So let's say we want the node title coming in here, and you want some custom text. Essentially, you just fill it in, hit save, and you get that pattern visible on the front end. And that's pretty much just drag, drop, fill it in, and save. So I'm going to try to squeeze a demo in here. Running a little short on time, but we'll see what we can do.
15 minutes.
Can I ask a quick question?
Absolutely.
Is that dynamic? So like if you update your design library, all that, the new schema gets rebuilt and everything?
Yep,
Yeah, that's
100%. So on our Connect site, we have, and let me get this preview over here. Cool. So this is a demo page running on our Connect site on my local machine on Docker. And this top template right here, this is from the Connect site's pattern library. So this is just a twig template with some JavaScript attached to it getting rendered out. But this second line, this notification, that one's straight from PatternFly. Granted, we changed the color, but the pattern itself is 100% PatternFly, and that's a separate pattern design system implementation that we loaded in with Pattern Kit, and that's just sitting in our theme directory, essentially. Let me go ahead and make some changes. So here's panels, Drupal 7, right? It's colored a little differently, but pretty much familiar to most people. By the way, if anything that I'm doing on here is something you haven't seen before, raise your hand, let me know, and I will definitely go over it. So in our panels pane editor, on our variant that we have created here for demo purposes, we have a layout that we've already chosen that's built into the theme, same way that you would normally define any layout. And I'm going to go ahead and add content. So we have all of our, production type stuff, but over here we have everything that Pattern Kit provides. So I'm going to go ahead and take a look at some of the components that we have ready for preview today. So you have like a Drupal messages component, and the one we're going to use here is a text label variants. And we're going to say we want to go ahead and configure the type, the text, we'll just configure everything. So we have all of these different options here. Eric, correct me if I'm wrong, but this one's straight from PatternFly as well, right?
Yep.
So this is a PatternFly component that we've literally just pulled straight into the site by dragging and dropping it into our theme folder.
Yeah,
or you could git clone or whatever you want to do, as long as you have a pattern library that has twig templates in it, and hopefully we're going to be adding support for a couple more templating systems. But if you have twig templates and you know what their schema is like, what variables they accept, then you can just use this editor and build them straight into your site.
Yeah, the only reason there's pre-populated values in those fields is because a schema file is generated for that component.
Mm-hmm.
But as you said, if there isn't a schema file, you just add the properties that you know are available, and you can map your content.
Exactly. So you can go ahead and just do demo goal text. Demo, perfect. Yeah, let's make it a card, and let's just clear out the icon. I don't want to use any icon today. You can kind of drag and drop these into your layout however you feel is appropriate. So ignoring my horrible typing, there you go. And that is literally just a twig template without any custom presenter mapping, any manual configuration. As far as like getting the code into Drupal, it's just all exposed via Pattern Kit here. This also does support CTools content types and tokens. So for example, if you have a node powering this panels page and you want to be able to use the title or something like that, you can type in the CTools token in there. One of the things that's on our features list that we want to be able to add to Pattern Kit is a whole drag and drop token display, so you don't have to actually know in advance what the tokens are you want to use. But it's on the to-do list. Let's add another one here just for funsies. I mean, obviously this stuff is still kind of a work in progress in some places. We just released a module a couple weeks ago. There's a whole backlog of things we want to do. Things like getting it to automatically detect, hey, which fields do we want by default, and pre-fill them with sample data or something like that, so it's more useful for your content admins to build. There you go. I'm going to show you, yeah, we got time for that. Cool. Bring up the actual source code of this real quick so you guys can kind of see how it's put together.
Can I ask you a quick question while you're doing that?
Absolutely.
What are the differences between the UI patterns effort and pattern kit? Like, is there differences in the problem you're trying to solve or the technique that you're using to solve it?
So we actually have an internal Drupal 7 version of the UI patterns module. It's called Pattern Kit Builder Importer, I think, right? That's the technical full name for it.
Pattern Builder Importer.
Pattern Builder Importer. But so as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that kind of comes with that, if you're building these patterns on the front end in Twig and then importing them into the site like the UI patterns module or the Pattern Builder Importer does, is you end up with this massive back end of all these fields and paragraphs and everything that there's no content architect behind, right? You're building your front end patterns, you're using them to be reusable in your design system, and you don't necessarily have a one-to-one for the back end relationship. So one of the ways people solve that is by doing those presenter layer mappers, right, the Twig templates. But like you saw, it's a lot more fun to just drag and drop and not have to worry about writing code. So Pattern Kit solves it differently by doing mapping, like you would in a Twig template. Just there's a GUI with it now, and it automatically imports all of your patterns into Drupal. It also supports like a hook, so you can kind of customize the way it's imported to your site. But yeah, that's the main difference there.
So the difference is like how you were selecting which things you wanted to use as a part of that pattern that you selected, right? And only mapping what you want to use.
Exactly.
Yeah, because usually like the Pattern Builder Importer, we end up with hundreds of extra fields. Like we have one use case where we're displaying a time to a user, but we need to put the UTC time as an attribute. That's actually 2 fields in there, even though one of them doesn't really need to be stored.
Right. So that label that you guys are seeing that I was just adding with Pattern Kit there in Drupal 7. So this is a Twig source for it. Can everybody see that? Right size, don't need to make it bigger. PHP Storm is always a little weird about presenting. So we just have, some markup here, and some Twig decision making, like, is it a card? If it's a card, throw another div around it with some pre-configured settings in it for our design system and SAS for it. Display an icon if it needs to, otherwise just show the text. So pretty standard, Twig template. And just a little bit of customization here in the SAS, and this just gets compiled to a CSS file that's included in the theme. We use Gulp for that, but Grunt or Webpack or however you want to compile your system. And these are just literally color overrides for PatternFly. So we don't have to do any of that implementation or anything else in PatternFly. It's just the tweaks that we want on our front end to kind of change the look of it a little bit. But where all the craziness sort of happens is, and this is kind of the new piece here, UI patterns in Drupal 8 uses YAML. We use JSON schema, but the schema essentially just describes all of those fields that you saw me inputting on the back end in panels. So our type O is a string, and you get to pick from all these different types that are provided by PatternFly. This is something we added into the system that exposes it over to the Drupal backend. If we didn't have this file, you could go ahead and use the Schema Editor to add fields yourself. Which is something you can do for any of these. So let's say you add an experimental property that you don't want exposed by default. You could go in here and, and as long as your template supports it, you can go and configure this however you need to. Like, okay, this takes a string. And that would just go right over to the Twig template. don't think I really got time to like go through all that, but it works, I promise, mostly.
So is there an intermediate Drupal template?
No. Nope, it's all handled in the module. You don't have to write anything in between. Because we're all settled on using panels, essentially, we also don't have to worry about like, is this a node template we're using or whatever. Now, panels does all that for us in Drupal 7 and Drupal 8.
I have a question. Can you still use the components module though to like say reuse the same markup and same style in like a view or in even in an existing twig, or is it just working exclusively with that like mapping you're talking about?
So theoretically you could. There's no code support for that in Pattern Kit because that would, I guess, kind of be weird to have to map that stuff over. And to us, if you're going to be using that type of functionality, especially in Drupal 8, you're probably better suited for the UI patterns module because at that point your site's probably not going to be that complicated, right? Use isn't that great for the enterprise level because it's not performant enough unless it's fully cached, and in that case it's like entity query is probably a better solution for you. But so this is the UI patterns module, which kind of answers some of that. By default, once you install it on a Drupal 8 site, if I had more time, I could actually go through that whole process, but it's relatively simple. Just spin up a Docker instance of the site and then install the module. But this is pulling in the foundation pattern library, which has all these kind of default cool out-of-the-box template items, and this is all provided at the /patterns URL on your site from the UI patterns module. And one of the things that Foundations comes with is instead of defining the schema in like JSON, it's all defined in YAML, and you can use a drush command to import all of that into your site. So this is where I was talking about that one-to-one relationship. Each one of these paragraphs here is also a front-end pattern. So if your data structure doesn't map that or match that, then you can't really use these patterns on your site without doing a whole bunch of additional work. And it doesn't really support mapping. You still need to have the same field names kind of coming over from the back end. But it does work with the layouts for your nodes. Your names and fields. It does work with display suite and views pretty much out of the box. So as long as you're able to configure everything to match your patterns 100%, everything just kind of works. So you can see it's the same set of content fields here. And one of these is, so like for example, if you want to use the callout pattern from your pattern library, then you want to use a paragraph that's mapped over to have the exact callout with read more paragraph here that has those exact fields that kind of map over to your front end.
So UI patterns is dependent on paragraphs?
No, you can use it with paragraphs, and that's all to get it working with like the layouts module. But I mean, you can do it with raw fields as well, as long as they're the same name. But if you want it working with display suite, you need to install that, et cetera, et cetera. I think most people that are using this on a production site are using it for brochureware, where it's not too complicated, and they'll install display suite and kind of just map things out really quick. So it's kind of like an alternative to spinning up something in WordPress with a pre-existing pattern library and building that out real quick. Okay, I got 3 or 4 more minutes here. Get back to the slideshow. So a couple of notes that I mentioned earlier. If you're using Twig for D7, you do need to use some patches. So if you're going to download Pattern Kit today and you have a Twig theme that you're using, make sure that you use beta 3 and use the patches that are available for namespaces. If you're going to test this out in Drupal 8, I have some links at the very end of this presentation that have all the details, and it'll be up on the Florida Drupalcamp site. But Zero Foundation does have some node stats issues, so you got to take a look at the issue queue for that. And Drupal theme builds obviously are still very complicated. This isn't like something where you can just kind of click a button and it all just goes, or npm run build, right? But we're getting there. We're all moving in that direction, and that's part of what Pattern Kit and even the UI patterns module, are trying to allow us to do. Is, hey, I like this patternfly.org design library implementation. I'm going to download it, throw it in either a Drupal module or theme, and then have it just run on my site. And all I got to do is write a small amount of CSS to kind of tweak the colors the way I want it to, and I get all the power of that library. And I can add my own libraries on top of that, or grab any of the other newer open source design systems implementations available on the web. So all this is kind of moving towards a unified approach to front end. Basically, where right now this is all still server-side rendering, right? So if you're going to decouple your site or do React or something like that, or Angular, you're still kind of in this in-between land where it's like, all right, we can't really just drag and drop and use this stuff. But that's kind of where Pattern Kit and this whole system is coming in, and where we're headed with it is where you could use a single set, 3 or 4, or even just one, pattern libraries that are design system implementations, and they work client-side, server-side, React, Angular, Drupal, wherever you want them to. And it's just one set of patterns. So to kind of conclude the presentation here, not go over the time limit, there's a checklist essentially for getting started with using pattern libraries, multiple pattern libraries in your design systems on your Drupal sites. First is making sure you start with the visual language and the design system that makes sense for your business. In our cases, we're using Atomic Design, and we have our own defined visual language for Red Hat that works with our brand and marketing. Then you want to pick the style guide, library, and frameworks that make sense for you. So in our case, we're using essentially an internal version of Pattern Lab that we're going to be pushing changes to, so that way the open source community can kind of benefit from the tweaks, the Schema Editor, for example. But I mean, you could use Storybook or anything else, that allows you to use these systems together, as long as it supports, Twig or hopefully Nunjux or something like that in the future, handlebars. And then Drupal integration. Go ahead and pick something that makes sense for what you're building. If you're building a small site and you don't really have to worry about the back end too much, then UI patterns might be a really good fit. If you have a very complicated site or an existing site that you really don't want to have to overhaul to work with the design system, then maybe Pattern Kit's a better answer for you. But either way, investing in a templated design system implementation like Twig or Nunjux, or even like React components with JSX, as long as it's a templated, compatible system, it's probably a pretty solid bet for the future. And whether you're using a JSON schema or YAML in order to define this interface, as long as you have one, as long as you're building them in the first place with your patterns, you're going to be able to adapt it to the future. I mean, transpiling your back-end code for your patterns, your schema definitions from either JSON to YAML isn't really that hard. If you want to get involved, there's a giant issue in the Drupal Pattern Lab GitHub namespace. Links right here, and it'll be on the Florida Drupalcamp site. Pattern Lab also has a big issue for getting some of these features kind of migrated over, making this stuff a little easier to use, a little easier to just download and get into. Everything I've talked about today is on this resources slide, so you can pretty much just go and grab any of these. There's readmes and instructions to get them working on your site. One of the ones that I kind of mentioned but didn't really go over too much is the fact that we can switch between these different pattern libraries on the go. We use ThemeKey for that, but you could also use like a Drupal module or just one monolithic theme with all the different pattern libraries in it. These are some of the commands that I was running in the background to get the sites up and loaded. Most of these are like copy, paste, run, and they go, which is pretty cool. So that's there for your reference. Special thanks to all these people that contributed, everyone at Red Hat that helped make this stuff possible. I know this is like a massive amount of information, but hopefully this kind of opens your eyes to, hey, this is what's possible. This is where we can go with our design systems implementations in the future. Any last minute questions? Cool, thank you guys so much for having me.